Jake Morrison had always been the class clown. At 19, he thought the world was his stage and everyone else was just part of his audience. Standing outside Buckingham Palace on a sunny Tuesday morning in London, he adjusted his baseball cap and grinned at his phone camera. He was live streaming to his 3,000 followers, most of them friends from back home in Ohio who thought his gap year in Europe was the coolest thing ever. "All right, guys, check this out," Jake whispered into his phone, zooming in on the iconic red-coated Queen's Guard standing perfectly still beside the palace gates. "I'm about to show you how these guys are basically just statues. Watch this." The guard stood motionless, his tall black bearskin hat casting a shadow over his face. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, brass buttons gleaming in the sunlight. He held his rifle at his side, eyes fixed straight ahead, seemingly unaware of the growing crowd of tourists snapping photos around him. Jake had heard all the stories about how the Queen's Guards never moved, never reacted, no matter what happened around them. His college buddies back home had dared him to test this theory, and Jake never backed down from a dare. Besides, what was the worst that could happen? It wasn't like he was going to hurt anyone. "These guys are supposed to be some kind of elite soldiers," Jake continued narrating to his phone, walking closer to the guard. "But look at this dude. He's like a wax figure. I bet I could do jumping jacks right in front of him and he wouldn't even blink." Other tourists began to notice Jake's approach, some pulling out their own phones to record what they sensed might become an entertaining moment. A few older visitors shook their heads disapprovingly, but Jake didn't notice. He was too focused on his performance. The Guardsman Thomas Wright, had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 4 years. He had done 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq before being selected for ceremonial duties at the palace. Behind his stoic expression, he was well aware of the American tourist approaching with obvious mischief in mind. Thomas had dealt with hundreds of tourists like Jake over the years, each one thinking they were the first to come up with the brilliant idea of testing a guard's discipline. Jake started with small gestures, waving his hand in front of the guard's face. "Hello, anybody home?" he said loudly, drawing more attention from the crowd. When the guard didn't react, Jake grew bolder. He began making faces, sticking out his tongue, and even did a little dance routine. The comments on his live stream were pouring in. His friends were laughing, egging him on with messages like "do something crazy" and "make him laugh." The viewer count was climbing rapidly as people shared the stream. "See? Told you guys," Jake said triumphantly to his camera. "This is too easy. These guys are all show and no substance. Just fancy dress-up soldiers playing? Pretend." What Jake didn't understand was that he was looking at a highly trained military professional who had sworn an oath to protect the crown and maintain the dignity of his position. The Queen's Guard weren't street performers or tourist attractions, despite how some visitors treated them. They were active duty soldiers with real responsibilities and the authority to enforce them. As Jake continued his antics, moving even closer to the guard, he began to cross invisible lines that existed for very good reasons. The palace had protocols, boundaries that weren't just suggestions but legal requirements that protected both the guards and the public. Thomas remained perfectly still, but his training kicked in. He began mentally cataloging Jake's actions, noting each violation of the strict rules that governed behavior around the royal guards. His fellow guards at nearby posts were also watching, ready to respond if the situation escalated. Jake, emboldened by what he saw as the guards' complete passivity, decided to take things further. "Watch this, guys," he told his phone, reaching into his backpack. "I'm going to see if I can get a reaction out of this statue." The crowd around them had grown larger, with more people recording the interaction. Some tourists looked uncomfortable with Jake's behavior, while others seemed entertained by the spectacle. A few parents pulled their children back, sensing that something was about to go wrong. But Jake was riding high on adrenaline and the attention from his online audience. He had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson about respect that would change his perspective forever. The guard he was taunting wasn't just a ceremonial figure in a costume. He was a soldier with the training, authority, and duty to maintain order and dignity at one of Britain's most important landmarks. As Jake prepared for his next move, completely unaware of the consequences heading his way, the ancient traditions and modern realities of the Queen's Guard were about to collide with his American teenager's sense of invincibility. What started as a harmless prank was about to become a very serious situation that would teach Jake more about respect, authority, and personal responsibility than any lecture from his parents ever could. Jake pulled out a bag of potato chips from his backpack, the crinkling sound cutting through the morning air. His live stream was now up to over 5,000 viewers, and the comments were flowing faster than he could read them. Most were encouraging him to continue, but a few warned him to stop. Jake ignored the warnings. "Okay guys, ultimate test time," Jake announced to his phone, opening the bag dramatically. "I'm going to offer this guy some chips. If he doesn't take them, I'm going to leave them right on his shoes. These guards supposedly can't move no matter what, right?" He approached the guard with exaggerated casual movements, holding out the bag. "Hey buddy, you hungry? You've been standing there for hours. Want some chips?" When the guard didn't respond, Jake chuckled and shook the bag closer to the guard's face. Guardsman Wright's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Jake was now violating multiple protocols. First, he was interfering with a guard on duty. Second, he was treating royal property with disrespect. Third, he was creating a disturbance that was affecting other visitors' experiences and potentially compromising security. The other tourists were becoming more uncomfortable. An elderly British woman approached Jake tentatively. "Excuse me, young man," she said with a polite but firm tone, "but perhaps you should leave the guard alone." "He's working." Jake turned to her with a dismissive grin. "Lady, relax. It's just a bit of fun. These guys are paid to stand here like statues. I'm not hurting anybody." He turned back to his phone. Can you believe that? Some people have no sense of humor. What Jake didn't realize was that the woman was Margaret Henderson, a retired teacher who had lived in London her entire life. Her late husband had served in the same regiment as the guard Jake was harassing. She knew exactly what these young men represented and what they had sacrificed to earn their position. "That young man has likely served his country in combat zones," Margaret said more firmly. "He deserves your respect, not your ridicule." Jake rolled his eyes. "Whatever, Grandma. Mind your own business." He turned back to the guard and, in a move that would seal his fate, began dropping potato chips one by one onto the guard's perfectly polished black boots. The crowd gasped. Several people stopped recording, sensing they were witnessing something that had crossed a serious line. But Jake was too caught up in his performance to notice the change in atmosphere. "Look at that, guys. I'm literally putting food on a royal guard's boots and he can't do anything about it." Jake laughed, stepping back to film the chips scattered around the guard's feet. "This is going to go viral for sure." Behind his stoic expression, Thomas Wright was reaching his limit. In his 4 years of ceremonial duty, he had dealt with drunk tourists, crying children, and countless people trying to make him laugh or move. But this level of deliberate disrespect and property damage was different. Jake wasn't just testing boundaries anymore. He was actively vandalizing royal property and creating a security concern. The protocol was clear. Guards were authorized to use necessary force to maintain order and protect royal property when verbal warnings failed and the situation warranted intervention. Jake's actions had now moved beyond harmless tourist behavior into territory that required a response. Thomas began the mental countdown that every Queen's Guard knew by heart. 3 more seconds of this behavior, and he would be authorized to act. Jake, completely oblivious to the danger he was creating, decided to escalate even further. "You know what, guys? I bet I can touch his hat and he still won't move. These guys are basically human mannequins." Jake reached up toward the guard's bearskin hat, his fingers just inches away from touching it. That was the moment Thomas Wright had been waiting for. Touching a guard's equipment was a direct violation that required immediate intervention. In one fluid motion that took less than 2 seconds, Thomas brought his rifle across his body into the ready position and took a single, thunderous step forward. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." His voice boomed across the courtyard with the authority of centuries of military tradition. Jake jumped backward so violently that he nearly dropped his phone. The sudden transformation from statue to intimidating soldier was so complete and terrifying that Jake's confident grin vanished instantly. His face went pale as he found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a man who had clearly transformed from decoration to deadly serious protector in the blink of an eye. The crowd fell completely, silent except for the scattered gasps and the sound of Jake's rapidly beating heart, which seemed loud enough for everyone to hear. His live stream chat exploded with messages, but Jake was no longer paying attention to his audience. For the first time in his life, he was face to face with real authority, real consequences, and real danger. The cocky American teenager who had been treating the guard like a tourist attraction suddenly realized he was standing in front of a trained soldier who had the legal authority and physical capability to enforce respect. Jake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. The joke was definitely over. The courtyard remained frozen in complete silence for what felt like an eternity. Jake stood there with his mouth hanging open, still holding his phone but no longer caring about his live stream. The guard's voice had been so powerful and commanding that it seemed to echo off the palace walls long after he had spoken. Thomas Wright held his position, rifle ready, his eyes locked onto Jake with an intensity that made the young American's knees shake. This wasn't the motionless statue Jake had been mocking moments before. This was a warrior who had seen real combat, who had been trained to protect and defend, and who now viewed Jake as a potential threat that needed to be neutralized. I said, "Stand back," Thomas commanded again when Jake failed to move quickly enough. His voice carried the weight of military authority that had been earned through years of training and battlefield experience. Jake stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking like a child's. I didn't mean—" "Pick up that rubbish now," Thomas ordered, gesturing toward the potato chips scattered around his boots. "You will clean up your mess, and then you will remove yourself from this area immediately." The transformation in Jake was remarkable. The confident prankster who had been entertaining thousands of online viewers was gone, replaced by a frightened young man who suddenly understood he had made a terrible mistake. His hands trembling, Jake dropped to his knees and began frantically gathering up the chips he had so carelessly scattered moments before. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jake crawled around on the ground, desperately collecting every crumb while the guard towered over him. Some tourists began recording again, but now they were documenting Jake's humiliation rather than his supposed triumph. Margaret Henderson, the elderly woman who had tried to warn Jake earlier, watched with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. She had seen this lesson taught many times over the years, though rarely to someone who had pushed things quite so far. "Please, sir, I'm really sorry," Jake pleaded as he stuffed the chips back into the bag with shaking hands. "I didn't know. I thought it was okay. I was just having fun." "Fun?" Thomas's voice was ice cold. "You think disrespecting Her Majesty's Guard is fun? You think treating a soldier of the crown like a circus performer is entertainment?" Jake's eyes filled with tears of shame and fear. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing real consequences for his actions. Back home, his parents had always bailed him out of trouble. His teachers had always given him second chances. His friends had always laughed off his pranks as harmless fun. But here, in front of Buckingham Palace, there was nowhere to hide. "No, sir," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, sir. I really am." Thomas maintained his position for several more seconds, letting the lesson sink in. Then, with the same precision and control that had marked his initial response, he slowly returned to his ceremonial stance. But his eyes remained fixed on Jake with a warning that was crystal clear. One more mistake and the consequences would be even more severe. 2 palace security officers had appeared during the confrontation, drawn by the commotion. They approached Jake as he finished cleaning up the chips, their expressions stern but not unkind. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of them said quietly. "There are some questions we need to ask you." Jake's heart sank even further. He had thought the humiliation was over, but clearly his troubles were just beginning. As the security officers escorted him away from the guard post, he caught a glimpse of his phone screen. The livestream was still running and the comments were brutal. "OMG, he's crying," read one message. "Serves him right," said another. "What an idiot," proclaimed a third. The viewer count had climbed to over 8,000 people, all of whom had witnessed his complete humiliation. But the worst part wasn't the online mockery. It was the look of profound disappointment in the eyes of the tourists who had watched the entire incident unfold. Jake realized that he had embarrassed not just himself but his entire country. He had been the ugly American tourist that everyone warned about, confirming every negative stereotype about entitled young Americans abroad. As they walked toward the security office, Jake glanced back at Thomas Wright, who had resumed his motionless stance as if nothing had happened. But Jake knew better now. Behind that stoic exterior was a man who commanded genuine respect, who had earned his position through service and sacrifice, and who would not tolerate disrespect from anyone. The guard had taught Jake a lesson that no classroom, no parent and no friend had ever managed to convey, that respect isn't given freely. It's earned, and when you encounter someone who has truly earned it, you show it, or you face the consequences. The security office loomed ahead, and Jake knew his day was about to get much worse. But something inside him had already changed. The scared young man walking toward that office was not the same cocky teenager who had approached the guard with a bag of chips and a smartphone just 20 minutes earlier. The security office inside Buckingham Palace was nothing like Jake had imagined. Instead of the grand, ornate rooms he had seen in movies, he found himself in a simple, sterile room with white walls, fluorescent lighting, and a metal desk. The two security officers who had escorted him sat across from him, their expressions serious but professional. "Right then," said Officer Davies, the older of the two men. He was in his 50s with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades dealing with difficult situations. "Let's start with your name and passport, please." Jake fumbled in his backpack with shaking hands, still processing what had just happened to him. "Jacob Morrison," he mumbled, handing over his American passport. "Everyone calls me Jake." Officer Davies examined the passport carefully while his partner, Officer Chen, took notes. "And what brings you to London, Mr. Morrison?" "Gap year," Jake replied quietly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "I'm supposed to start college in the fall. My parents thought it would be good for me to travel and see the world." "I see," Davies said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "And how do you think your parents would feel about what just happened out there?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He had been so focused on impressing his online followers that he hadn't thought about his parents at all. His mother and father had saved for years to give him this opportunity. They had trusted him to represent his family and his country well during his travels. "They'd be really disappointed," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Disappointed?" Officer Chen spoke for the first time. She was younger than her partner, perhaps in her 30s, with kind eyes that somehow made Jake feel even worse about his behavior. "Mr. Morrison, do you understand what you did out there?" Jake shrugged helplessly. "I was just trying to make a funny video. I didn't think it was such a big deal." The two officers exchanged glances. Davies leaned forward in his chair. "Let me explain something to you, son. That guard you were harassing isn't a tourist attraction. His name is Guardsman Thomas Wright. He's 23 years old, just 4 years older than you. He's done 2 combat tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. He's seen friends die protecting people like you and me." Jake's face went pale. He had never considered that the guard might be a real soldier with real experiences. Officer Chen continued the explanation. "When Thomas was 20, the same age you are now, he was in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, protecting a forward operating base. His unit was attacked by Taliban fighters. 3 of his friends died that day. Thomas was wounded but kept fighting until reinforcements arrived." "I didn't know," Jake whispered, feeling sick to his stomach. "Of course you didn't," Davies said, "because you didn't bother to think about who he was as a person. You saw a uniform and decided he was there for your entertainment." The room fell silent except for the sound of Jake's ragged breathing. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake, but the officers weren't finished with his education. "The Queen's Guard isn't just a ceremonial position," Officer Chen explained. "These men and women are active duty soldiers who have earned the right to protect the royal family through exceptional service. They're not allowed to move or respond to tourists because they're on duty. Protecting one of the most important buildings in Britain. When you dropped food on his boots and tried to touch his equipment," Davies added, "you weren't just being disrespectful. You were potentially creating a security risk. For all Thomas knew, you could have been concealing a weapon or planning something more serious." Jake's eyes widened in horror. "I would never. I'm not a terrorist or anything. I was just making a video." "Thomas doesn't know that," Chen pointed out. All he knew was that a young man was acting aggressively, refusing to follow basic protocols, and escalating his behavior despite warnings from other visitors. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in for Jake. He hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had potentially made a combat veteran feel threatened while that veteran was trying to do his job protecting the royal family. "What happens now?" Jake asked, dreading the answer. Davies consulted his notes. "Well, technically you violated several laws, interfering with a member of the armed forces in the execution of their duty, littering on royal property, creating a public disturbance, and potentially threatening behavior toward a security officer." Jake's heart sank. "Am I going to jail?" "That depends," Chen said. "This is your first offense and you're young. The Crown Prosecution Service might be willing to offer you an alternative if you're genuinely sorry and willing to make amends." "I am sorry," Jake said quickly. "I really am. I feel terrible about what I did." "Saying you're sorry is a start," Davies acknowledged. "But we need to see that you understand why what you did was wrong. Not just that you're sorry you got caught." For the next hour, the officers explained British law, military protocols, and the historical significance of the Queen's Guard. They showed Jake videos of other incidents where tourists had crossed the line and the consequences that had followed. They explained how his behavior could have been interpreted as a security threat in a world where terrorism was a real and constant concern. By the end of the conversation, Jake was crying openly, not from fear of punishment but from genuine shame at his behavior. He was beginning to understand that his actions had real consequences for real people, and that the world didn't exist for his entertainment. "There is one option available to you," Davies said finally, "but it would require you to do something that might be difficult for someone your age." Jake looked up hopefully. "Anything. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Officer Davies leaned back in his chair and studied Jake carefully. "The alternative we're offering is called a restorative justice conference. Instead of formal charges, you would meet face-to-face with Guardsman Wright when he's off duty. You would have the opportunity to apologize properly and learn more about what his service means." Jake's eyes widened. The thought of facing the guard again, especially after what he now knew about the man's military background, was terrifying. But it was better than criminal charges and potentially being deported. You would also be required to perform 40 hours of community service at a veterans support center here in London, Officer Chen added. You'd be helping ex-servicemen and women who are dealing with various challenges after their military careers. And, Davies continued, you would need to create and post a public apology video, explaining what you learned and encouraging other tourists to show proper respect when visiting royal sites. Jake nodded eagerly. Yes, I'll do all of that. When can I meet with Thomas? I mean, Guardsman Wright? Tomorrow afternoon, Chen replied. He'll be off duty then. But Jake? She leaned forward using his first name for the first time. This isn't going to be easy. Thomas is angry about what happened. You humiliated him in front of hundreds of people and treated his service like a joke. The next 24 hours were the longest of Jake's life. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and definitely couldn't bring himself to check his social media accounts. The video of his confrontation with the guard had been shared thousands of times, with most comments condemning his behavior. His parents had somehow found out about the incident and called him, their disappointment clear even across the Atlantic. When the time came for the meeting, Jake arrived at the community center 30 minutes early. His hands were sweating and his stomach was in knots. He had prepared a speech, but every version he wrote seemed inadequate for what he needed to say. Thomas Wright walked into the room in civilian clothes, but he was no less intimidating than he had been in uniform. At 23, he was tall and fit, with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility and respect. His eyes were hard when they met Jake's. Mr. Morrison, Thomas said formally, taking a seat across from him. A mediator, Mrs. Patricia Holmes, sat between them to facilitate the conversation. Please, Jake said immediately. Call me Jake, and I want to start by saying how sorry I am. Not just for getting in trouble, but for how I treated you. Thomas studied him for a long moment. Do you know what I was thinking about when you were dropping chips on my boots? Jake shook his head, afraid to speak. I was thinking about my mate Danny, Thomas said quietly. He died 3 years ago in Afghanistan. Stepped on an IED while we were on patrol. He was 20 years old, same as you are now. Danny used to joke that when we got back to London, he wanted to be a Queen's Guard so he could stand at the palace and protect something beautiful instead of watching everything get destroyed. Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, Thomas replied, his voice steady but emotional. Because you didn't see me as a person. You saw me as a prop for your entertainment. You treated my uniform, which represents everything Danny died for, like it was a costume. The words hit Jake like physical blows. He had thought he understood the gravity of his mistake, but hearing it from Thomas himself made it real in a way that no lecture from the security officers could have achieved. When I'm standing guard, Thomas continued, I'm not just protecting the palace. I'm honoring every soldier who came before me. Every friend I lost, every family member who worried about me coming home. That uniform represents sacrifice, duty, and service to something bigger than myself. Jake wiped his eyes with his sleeve. How can I make this right? I know saying sorry isn't enough. For the first time since entering the room, Thomas's expression softened slightly. The fact that you're here asking that question is a start. Most people who do what you did just want to avoid consequences. You seem to actually care about the damage you caused. Mrs. Holmes, the mediator, spoke for the first time. Jake, Thomas has agreed to this meeting because he believes in second chances, but he also wants to make sure you understand the broader impact of your actions. What do you mean? Jake asked. Thomas leaned forward. Your video has been seen by millions of people now. Some of them are laughing at you, which is probably embarrassing, but others are laughing at me, at my uniform, at what I represent. You didn't just disrespect one guard. You disrespected everyone who's ever worn this uniform. The weight of that revelation settled on Jake like a crushing burden. He had thought his prank was harmless fun, but he was beginning to understand that his actions had rippled far beyond that single moment at the palace gates. What can I do? Jake asked desperately. There has to be something I can do to help fix this. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering. Well, he said finally, you could start by learning what it actually means to serve others instead of just serving yourself. 3 months later, Jake Morrison was a completely different person than the cocky teenager who had live-streamed his humiliation at Buckingham Palace. He was finishing his final week of community service at the London Veterans Support Centre, where he had been working every day since his meeting with Thomas Wright. The work had been eye-opening in ways Jake never could have imagined. He had spent time with former soldiers dealing with PTSD, helping elderly veterans with grocery shopping and medical appointments, and assisting with job placement programs for ex-servicemen struggling to find work in civilian life. One of the veterans Jake had grown closest to was a man named Robert, a 70-year-old former paratrooper who had served in the Falklands War. Robert had initially been skeptical of the young American who had been assigned to help him, especially after learning about Jake's palace incident. So you're the lad who thought it was funny to mock a Queen's Guard, Robert had said during their first meeting, his weathered face stern with disapproval. Yes, sir, Jake had replied, no longer trying to make excuses. I was an idiot, and I'm here to try to make up for it. Over the weeks that followed, Robert had become something of a mentor to Jake, sharing stories of military life and helping the young man understand what service and sacrifice really meant. Through Robert and the other veterans, Jake learned about the brotherhood that existed among soldiers, the way they looked out for each other both during and after their service. The thing about respect, Robert had told him one afternoon as they sorted donations for homeless veterans, is that it's not something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions day after day, year after year. Jake had taken those words to heart. He approached his community service not as a punishment to be endured, but as an opportunity to learn and grow. He arrived early every day, stayed late when needed, and genuinely cared about the people he was helping. Thomas Wright had visited the center several times during Jake's service, checking on his progress. The relationship between the two young men had evolved from anger and humiliation to something approaching mutual respect. Thomas could see that Jake was genuinely trying to change, and Jake had developed a deep admiration for Thomas's dedication to service. On Jake's final day at the center, Thomas arrived with a surprise. I wanted to give you something, he said, handing Jake a small package. Inside was a military challenge coin from Thomas's regiment, along with a handwritten note that read, For Jake, you came here as someone who took things from others for your own entertainment. You're leaving as someone who gives to others for their benefit. That's the difference between a boy and a man. Thomas. Jake felt tears in his eyes as he read the note. Thank you, he said simply. This means more to me than you know. That evening, Jake posted his final video about the experience. Instead of the flashy, attention-seeking content he had created before, this was a simple, heartfelt reflection on what he had learned. 3 months ago, I thought respect was something weak people gave to authority figures, he said to his camera. I thought soldiers were just guys playing dress-up, and that my entertainment was more important than their dignity. I was wrong about everything. He went on to describe his time at the Veterans Center, the stories he had heard, and the men and women he had met who had sacrificed years of their lives in service to others. He talked about Thomas Wright, not as the scary guard who had humiliated him, but as a young man who had chosen to dedicate his life to protecting others. The Queen's Guard aren't there for your amusement, Jake concluded. They're there because they've earned the right to stand in that position through service, sacrifice, and dedication. If you ever visit London and see them, remember that you're looking at some of the best soldiers in the world and act accordingly. The video received millions of views, but this time the response was overwhelmingly positive. Veterans from around the world thanked Jake for his honesty and growth. Parents shared the video with their children as an example of taking responsibility for mistakes. Even some of Jake's old followers, who had initially encouraged his disrespectful behavior, commented about how much they had learned from watching his journey. 6 months later, Jake returned to the United States to start college, but he was no longer the same person who had left. He enrolled in a program that would allow him to work with veteran support services, inspired by his time in London. He also began volunteering at VA hospitals near his campus. Thomas Wright received a letter from Jake every few months, updating him on his studies and volunteer work. In one letter, Jake wrote, "You taught me that real strength isn't about getting people to laugh at your jokes or getting attention online. Real strength is about serving something bigger than yourself, even when no one is watching." The incident that had started as a thoughtless prank had become a turning point in Jake's life. He had learned that respect isn't just a courtesy you show to avoid consequences. It's a recognition of the value and dignity that every person possesses, especially those who have dedicated their lives to serving others. Years later, when Jake told the story of his encounter with the Queen's Guard, it wasn't with embarrassment or shame, but with gratitude. That moment of humiliation had become the catalyst for the most important lesson of his life. That growing up isn't about getting older. It's about learning to see beyond yourself and understanding your place in a world where everyone deserves dignity and respect. The Queen's Guard had indeed taught him respect the hard way, but it was a lesson that would guide him for the rest of his life.